Welcome to Snooze and Stories. Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself drift back through time. Back past the digital age, past the Industrial Revolution, past the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. Back past the Roman Empire and its legions. Back more than 2,000 years to a world lit by oil lamps and starlight, where marble temples gleamed white against blue skies, where philosophers debated in shaded gardens, and where the very idea of what it meant to think, to know, to understand was being invented. We are going to ancient Greece in the 4th century before the Common Era. It is a world smaller than ours in geography, but perhaps larger in ambition. A world of city-states clinging to the coasts of the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, each jealously guarding its independence, each contributing its own character to what we now call classical civilization. Athens with its democracy and drama, Sparta with its warriors and austere discipline, Thebes, Corinth, the island cities, the colonies spreading across the known world. It is a world emerging from one great war, the Peloponnesian War that tore Greece apart, and heading toward another transformation as a kingdom to the north, Macedonia, rises to dominate them all. It is a world where Homer's epics are the common cultural currency, where every educated person can recite long passages about Achilles and Odysseus, where the gods still receive sacrifices, though some of the brightest minds are beginning to seek natural explanations for what religion attributes to divine will. Into this world, in the year 384 BCE, in a modest town on the northern edge of the Greek world, a boy is born who will change how humans think forever. His name is Aristotle. Perhaps you know him already, at least by reputation, the philosopher, the student of Plato, the teacher of Alexander the Great, the man whose ideas dominated Western thought for nearly 2,000 years, the systematizer, the classifier, the one who tried to understand everything from the movements of the stars to the nature of justice, from the anatomy of sea creatures to the structure of a good story. But tonight, we are not here simply to learn about his philosophy, though we will encounter his ideas. We are here to discover the man, the human being who lived those 62 years, who experienced joy and grief, love and loss, success and exile, who was orphaned young and never quite belonged anywhere, who spent 20 years in the shadow of the greatest philosopher of the age, then struck out on his own path, who married twice and raised children, who walked along seashores examining shells and dissecting fish, who tried to teach a teenage boy to be wise, only to watch that boy conquer the known world, who built a school that became a model for all schools to come, who was driven from the city he loved and died far from home. This is a story about curiosity, the kind of relentless, all-consuming curiosity that cannot rest until it understands, that asks why about everything, that sees a bird in flight and wants to know the mechanics of it, that observes human behavior and seeks the principles beneath it. It is a story about ambition, not for power or wealth, but for knowledge, for comprehension, for the satisfaction of understanding how things work and why they are the way they are. And it is a story about legacy, about how one person's thoughts can echo across millennia, shaping civilizations, inspiring generations, continuing to matter long after empires have crumbled and languages have died. If you enjoy these historical stories, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures you'd like to hear about, leave a comment below. So settle in. Let the tensions of the day fall away. We have a long journey ahead of us, from a small town in northern Greece to the philosophical gardens of Athens, from the coast of Asia Minor to the court of Macedon, from the heights of intellectual achievement to the bitterness of exile. This is the story of Aristotle, not as a marble bust in a museum, not as a name in a philosophy textbook, but as a living, breathing human being who tried to understand the world, and in doing so, helped us all understand it better. Let us begin at the beginning, in that northern town called Stagira, where a physician serves a king and where a child is born into a world that does not yet know how profoundly he will change it. The town of Stagira clings to the coast of the Chalcidice Peninsula, that three-fingered hand of land that reaches down into the northern Aegean Sea. It is 384 BCE, and this is frontier country. Greek, yes, but at the very edge of the Greek world. To the south and west lie the great city-states of Hellas, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth. To the north and east lies Macedonia, a kingdom that proper Greeks regard with suspicion, barely considering them civilized, despite their claims to Greek ancestry. Stagira itself is modest, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 inhabitants, stone houses with tile roofs climbing up from a small harbor, narrow streets, a marketplace where farmers bring olive oil and wine, where fishermen sell their catch, an agora where citizens gather to discuss the affairs of their polis, temples to the gods, Apollo, Athena, Poseidon who rules the sea that sustains them. The town walls, necessary in an age when war is always possible, when pirates raid coastal settlements, when the balance of power shifts constantly between Greek cities and the Macedonian kingdom that looms over them. Into this world, in this modest town, a child is born to the household of Nicomachus and Phaestus. They name him Aristoteles. Aristotle. The name means the best purpose, or perhaps excellent end. Words heavy with aspiration, with hope for what this child might become. Every parent hopes their child will be exceptional, but how could Nicomachus and Phaestus know that this baby, squalling and red-faced like any other newborn, will one day be called simply the philosopher, as if no other philosopher in the world matters quite as much? Nicomachus is not an ordinary citizen of Stagira. He is a physician, and not just any physician. He serves as the personal doctor to King Amyntas III of Macedon, whose court is at Pella, a day's journey to the northwest. This is a position of tremendous prestige and responsibility. In an age when medicine is still emerging from the realm of magic and religious ritual into something approaching systematic knowledge, when the theories of Hippocrates are revolutionary and new, a royal physician must be extraordinarily skilled, knowledgeable, and trustworthy. Kings are paranoid about poisoning, about illness, about the vulnerability of their mortal flesh. A royal physician must know the properties of hundreds of plants and minerals, must understand the theory of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and how their balance determines health. Must be able to diagnose from subtle signs, the color of urine, the texture of the tongue, the quality of the pulse. Must know when to purge, when to bleed, when to prescribe rest or exercise or particular foods. Must be able to set broken bones, to stitch wounds, to ease pain, to comfort the dying when nothing more can be done. Nicomachus likely belongs to the Asclepiads, a guild or family of physicians who trace their lineage, real or symbolic, back to Asclepius, the god of healing. The Asclepiads pass their knowledge from father to son, generation after generation, creating a continuity of medical tradition. They are empiricists before the word exists, believers in observation and experience rather than pure theory. They dissect animals to understand anatomy. They keep detailed records of cases, of treatments and outcomes. They debate among themselves about methods and theories. Imagine the household where young Aristotle grows up, the workroom where his father prepares medicines. Clay jars and bronze containers line the shelves, each carefully labeled. Dried herbs hang from the ceiling, yarrow for wounds, willow bark for fever and pain, poppy for sleep and relief. There are mineral substances, sulfur, alum, various salts ground into fine powders, animal products, honey for wounds, bile for digestion, fat for ointments. The smell would be distinctive, herbal, slightly medicinal, earthy, not unpleasant exactly, but complex, layered, the accumulated scent of healing substances. Perhaps young Aristotle watches his father work, watches those careful hands measuring, grinding, mixing.
watches him examine patients, looking at their eyes, their skin, feeling their pulse, asking questions about their symptoms. The careful observation, the systematic inquiry, the assumption that the world can be studied and understood, that careful attention reveals patterns, that asking why and how are the keys to knowledge. His mother, Phaestus, comes from Chalcis on the island of Euboea, a significant city across the Aegean. We know frustratingly little about her. Ancient sources rarely tell us much about women, even women who matter. Was she educated? Did she teach young Aristotle his letters? Did she tell him stories of her island home? We can only speculate. But her heritage will prove important later in Aristotle's life, providing him with a refuge when he desperately needs one.
The household is comfortable, perhaps even prosperous. A royal physician is well compensated. There are slaves to manage the household work. This is ancient Greece, where slavery is as natural as sunrise, where even kind masters own other human beings. There are probably tutors for the children's early education. There are certainly books, those precious scrolls of papyrus or parchment, each one copied by hand, expensive and rare. Perhaps medical texts, the writings of Hippocrates and his school. Perhaps Homer's epics, the Iliad and Odyssey that every Greek child learns, the stories that define what it means to be Greek, to value honor and cleverness, to strive for excellence. Aristotle has siblings, an older sister, Arymneste, a brother whose name the sources don't preserve with certainty. They grow up together in this house overlooking the Aegean, in this town poised between Greek and Macedonian worlds. Childhood in ancient Greece, for those of good families, means play, yes, but also early education. Learning to read and write Greek, not an easy task, those letters so different from what we use now. Learning arithmetic, memorizing poetry. For boys, physical training, wrestling, running, throwing the discus and javelin. The Greeks believe in educating both mind and body, in creating balanced human beings. What was Aristotle like as a child? The sources don't tell us. They are interested in the great philosopher, not the boy. But we can imagine. Curious, certainly. The kind of child who asks endless questions. Why does the sun rise? Where do birds go in winter? What makes people laugh or cry? Why do some plants have thorns and others don't? The kind of questions that delight some parents and exhaust others. Perhaps his father encourages this curiosity, sees in his son an apt student for medicine, a successor to carry on the Asclepiad tradition. Perhaps they go on walks together, and Nicomachus points out medicinal plants, explains their uses. Perhaps he shows young Aristotle anatomical structures in dissected animals, explaining how the organs work together, how blood flows, how breathing happens. But then tragedy strikes, as it so often does in the ancient world, where life is fragile, where infections kill quickly, where accidents and illnesses that we would treat easily prove fatal. Nicomachus dies. We don't know when exactly. Aristotle is young, perhaps 10 or 11, certainly not yet an adult. We don't know how. Perhaps disease, perhaps injury, perhaps simply the accumulation of years and strain. For a physician to die feels particularly cruel, as if all his knowledge and skill cannot save him from the common fate of mortals. And then, if the sequence of losses wasn't already unbearable, Phaestus dies too. Again, we don't know the details. Illness, almost certainly. Perhaps grief weakened her after losing her husband. Perhaps disease swept through the household. The ancient sources are maddeningly vague about personal tragedies, giving us only the bare fact: both parents dead while Aristotle is still a child. Imagine the grief. The world suddenly empty of the two presences who defined it. The security of childhood ripped away. The future, which seemed settled and assured, suddenly uncertain. Who will care for them? What will happen to the house, the books, the life they knew? In Greek society, orphans of good families do not become destitute. There are structures of kinship and obligation, networks of responsibility that catch those who fall. For Aristotle and his siblings, that safety net comes in the form of a man named Proxenus of Artanis.
Proxenus may be a relative, perhaps married to Arymneste, Aristotle's older sister, or perhaps related to Phaestus's family from Chalcis. The exact relationship is unclear in our sources, lost to the erosion of time. What matters is that Proxenus takes his guardianship seriously. He doesn't simply manage the children's inheritance and leave them to servants. He brings them into his own household, assumes responsibility for their upbringing, for their education, for preparing them for adult life. And so Aristotle leaves Stagira, leaves the house where he was born, leaves the Greek mainland entirely. Proxenus lives in Artanis, a city on the coast of Asia Minor, across the Aegean in what is now western Turkey. Another displacement for the boy, another severance. First, the loss of his parents, now the loss of his birthplace, his home, everything familiar. The journey itself must have been significant. Several days by ship across the Aegean, island hopping perhaps, finally landing on the Asian coast. For a boy who has never traveled far from Stagira, it must be overwhelming. The sea stretching to the horizon, the strange ports, the different accents of Greek spoken in eastern cities, the presence of the Persian Empire that controls most of Asia Minor, making Greek cities there more cosmopolitan, more multicultural, more aware that they exist at the boundary between Greek and Oriental worlds.
Atarneus is larger than Stagira, more sophisticated, with more resources for education. Under Proxenus's guardianship, Aristotle receives the education appropriate for a young man of his station. He studies with tutors, learning the curriculum that every educated Greek must master. Grammar and literature first, not just reading and writing, but deep study of the great poets, Homer above all, those endless lines about heroes and gods, about Achilles' rage and Odysseus' cunning. The tragic poets, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, with their dark explorations of fate and justice, of what humans owe to gods and to each other. The lyric poets, Sappho's passionate fragments, Pindar's elaborate victory odes. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech. This is crucial in Greek society, where public speaking is essential for any man who wants to participate in civic life. How to construct an argument, how to appeal to an audience's emotions and reason, how to defend yourself in court or advocate for policy in the assembly. The sophists teach these skills, traveling from city to city, taking payment for instruction in how to argue effectively, how to make the weaker argument appear stronger. Mathematics and geometry. Music, not just performance but theory, the mathematical ratios that create harmony, the modes and scales that evoke different emotions. Gymnastics and physical training, because the Greeks believe in cultivating the body as well as the mind, in creating balanced, capable human beings. And through all of this, something is growing in young Aristotle, a quality that will define his entire life. An insatiable hunger to understand. Not just to know facts, though he loves facts, collects them like other boys collect stones, but to understand why, to grasp the principles beneath the surface, to see the patterns that connect seemingly different phenomena. When he sees a flock of birds flying in formation, he doesn't just observe their beauty. He wonders, how do they coordinate without a leader? What signals do they use? What purpose does the V shape serve? When he watches craftsmen at work, a potter shaping clay, a blacksmith forging iron, he wonders about the properties of materials, about how heat transforms substances, about the knowledge embedded in these practical skills. When he listens to political debates in the agora, he wonders what makes some arguments convincing and others not. What is justice, really? Why do people organize themselves into cities? What distinguishes a good government from a bad one? These questions have no easy answers. The old explanations, the myths and stories that attribute everything to gods and fate, don't satisfy him. He has been raised in the empirical tradition of medicine, trained to look for natural causes, to believe that the world operates according to principles that can be discovered and understood.
As Aristotle moves through his teenage years in Atarneus, as he grows from grieving child to thoughtful young man, it becomes increasingly clear that his education here, as good as it is, cannot take him as far as his mind wants to go. He needs more books, more teachers, more sophisticated debates, more people who share his passion for understanding. Proxenus sees this. He sees the quality of Aristotle's mind, the relentless curiosity, the potential for something extraordinary. And he knows that there is really only one place in the Greek world for a young man of exceptional intellect and philosophical inclination: Athens. Athens, the city of Athena, goddess of wisdom. Athens, where democracy was invented, where citizens debate and vote on every important decision. Athens, which produced the great tragedians whose plays Aristotle has studied. Athens, where Socrates walked the streets, questioning everyone he met about virtue and knowledge, where he was eventually executed for corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. Athens, where Socrates' student Plato has established a school, the Academy, devoted to pursuing truth through rational inquiry. The Academy. Even in distant Atarneus, even to a teenager, the name carries weight. This is where the brightest minds gather. This is where philosophy, still a relatively new word, meaning love of wisdom, is being developed as a systematic discipline. This is where you go if you want to think deeply about the fundamental questions of existence. Arrangements are made. Proxenus provides funds. Athens is expensive, and a foreign student needs money for tuition, for housing, for books, for daily life. Letters of introduction are written. Practical preparations proceed. What to bring, what to leave behind. The books Aristotle has accumulated, precious things, carefully packed. Clothes appropriate for Athens' climate and social expectations. Enough money to last until he can establish himself.
And then comes the day of departure. Aristotle is 17, perhaps 18, on the cusp of adulthood by Greek standards. Old enough to leave the guardianship of Proxenus, old enough to make his own way in the world, young enough that everything still seems possible. He boards a ship bound for Athens. As the coast of Asia Minor recedes behind him, as the ship makes its way west across the Aegean, he must feel both excitement and apprehension. He is leaving behind everything he knows, his guardian, his sister, the household that has been his home since his parents died. He is traveling to the greatest city in Greece, a place he knows only by reputation, to study with philosophers whose works he has read, but whom he has never met. What will Athens be like? Will he be accepted? Will he prove worthy of the Academy? Will his mind measure up to the brilliant students there? The ship sails on, past islands, Chios, Andros, others whose names he knows from Homer, past fishing boats and merchant vessels, under stars that ancient sailors use for navigation, following routes traveled for centuries. Finally, the coast of Attica appears. The ship enters the harbor at Piraeus, Athens' port. The bustle of docking, of cargo being unloaded, of passengers disembarking. Aristotle gathers his belongings, steps onto the dock, onto Athenian territory. From Piraeus, it is about 5 miles to Athens itself, 5 miles to walk or ride, gradually ascending from sea level toward the city. As he travels this road, other travelers around him, he must feel his heart beating faster. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next hill, lies Athens, the Acropolis with its temples, the Agora where Socrates used to argue, the theaters where Sophocles' plays were first performed, the law courts where citizens debate justice. And northwest of the city, in a sacred grove, the Academy waits. Plato waits, though Aristotle doesn't know it yet. His destiny waits. He is walking toward the life that will define him, walking toward 20 years of study that will shape everything he becomes, walking toward conversations and debates and insights that will eventually change how humanity thinks about everything, from logic to ethics, from physics to politics, from biology to art.
But for now, he is just a young man with a bundle of possessions and a head full of questions, making his way toward Athens as the sun climbs higher in the sky, ready to begin.
The Academy lies about a mile northwest of Athens' walls, in a grove of trees that has been sacred since time immemorial. The place takes its name from Academus, a legendary hero who once saved Athens from destruction, or so the story goes. The grove has temples and altars, cypress and olive trees casting dappled shade, paths winding between them. It is peaceful here, removed from the noise and press of the city, a place conducive to thought. About 20 years before Aristotle's arrival, Plato purchased land here and established his school. Not a school in the traditional sense, not a place where a sophist teaches rhetoric for payment, not a mystery cult with secret rites. Something new, something unprecedented, an institution devoted entirely to the pursuit of truth through rational inquiry and dialogue. When Aristotle first walks up the path from the city, through the grove toward the Academy, he is entering a world that will shape the rest of his life. It is 367 BCE, and he is 17 or 18 years old, a foreigner from the north, an orphan raised by a guardian, carrying letters of introduction and enough money to support himself for a while, hoping to be accepted into this legendary institution. The Academy has no grand buildings yet, no lecture halls in marble. Instead, there are gardens and colonnaded walkways where one can stroll while talking, shaded areas with benches where small groups gather, a gymnasium for physical exercise, because Plato believes in training the body as well as the mind. Simple buildings for dining together, for housing books and tablets, for meeting when weather drives them indoors. What strikes Aristotle first is the atmosphere, the intensity of it. Everywhere he looks, there are small groups engaged in conversation, not idle chat, but focused philosophical discussion. 2 or 3 men arguing about the nature of justice, testing definitions, pushing each other's thinking. A teacher explaining geometric proofs to students drawing diagrams in the dust. Someone reading aloud from a dialogue, others listening intently, preparing to discuss it. And over it all, like the sun around which planets orbit, is Plato himself. Plato is about 60 years old when Aristotle arrives, but his mind has lost none of its sharpness, none of its fire. He is tall, broad-shouldered. His nickname Plato supposedly comes from his wide frame, from Platos, meaning breadth. He comes from aristocratic Athenian lineage, descended from the ancient kings of Athens, from Solon, the great lawgiver. He could have pursued political power. Indeed, he tried, disastrously, in Syracuse, but instead he has devoted himself to philosophy, to the questions his teacher Socrates taught him to ask. Socrates, who questioned everyone about virtue and knowledge, who claimed to know nothing but could expose everyone else's ignorance, who was executed by Athens in 399 BCE on charges of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods. Socrates, whose death haunts Plato still, decades later, whose memory drives everything the Academy does. Athens killed the best man in Greece. Plato will not let it happen again. He will create a place where philosophy can flourish, where truth can be pursued without persecution. But Plato has gone beyond Socrates. Socrates questioned and probed, but claimed to know nothing, offered no positive doctrine. Plato has built something comprehensive, a complete vision of reality that is breathtaking in its scope and audacity. At the heart of it is his theory of forms or ideas. The physical world we perceive with our senses, Plato teaches, is not ultimate reality. It is a realm of shadows, of imperfect copies, of constant change and decay. True reality lies beyond this world, in a realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms. The form of beauty itself, of which all beautiful things are imperfect imitations. The form of justice itself, of which all just actions are partial reflections. The form of the good itself, the highest form, which illuminates all the others like the sun illuminates the visible world.
This theory has profound implications. It means that true knowledge, episteme, not mere opinion or belief, cannot come from sense perception. The senses show us only the changing, unreliable physical world. True knowledge comes from reason, from the mind's ability to grasp these eternal forms through philosophical contemplation. Plato illustrates this with his famous allegory of the cave, which Aristotle will hear expounded many times during his years here. Imagine humans chained in a cave since childhood, facing a wall, unable to turn around. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, seeing only shadows, believe these shadows are reality. But if one prisoner were freed, turned around, forced to look at the fire and the real objects, he would initially be confused and pained by the light. If dragged further, out of the cave entirely into the sunlight, he would be even more overwhelmed. But gradually his eyes would adjust and he would see true reality, the sun itself, which illuminates everything. This, Plato teaches, is the philosopher's journey, from the cave of sense perception to the light of true knowledge, from opinion to understanding, from the many to the one, from particular things to the universal forms.
Aristotle, encountering these ideas for the first time, must be both exhilarated and unsettled. He has come from a background of medical observation, of studying the physical world to understand it. And here is a philosopher telling him that the physical world is the least real thing there is, that ultimate reality is invisible, intangible, accessible only through abstract intellectual vision. But he is young, brilliant, hungry to learn. He throws himself into academy life with characteristic intensity. The daily rhythm of the academy becomes his rhythm, rising with the sun, morning exercises, wrestling, running, training the body because a healthy body supports a healthy mind. Then lessons. Plato believes mathematics is essential training for philosophy, the best way to learn to think about abstract, eternal truths. So Aristotle studies geometry, learning Euclid's proofs, understanding how from a few axioms one can derive an entire system of certain knowledge. He studies arithmetic and proportion, the mathematical ratios that produce musical harmony, the numerical relationships that structure reality. Above the entrance to the academy, it is said, is inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Mathematics is the gateway to philosophy because it trains the mind to think about unchanging truths, about relationships that are eternal and necessary rather than contingent and fleeting. Then there is dialectic, the art of philosophical argument that Socrates made famous. The method is question and answer, proposal and refutation, following the argument wherever it leads. Someone proposes a definition, say that courage is standing firm in battle. Others question it. What about the courage to endure illness, to face poverty, to admit one's ignorance? The definition is tested, found wanting, refined, or abandoned. New proposals emerge. The discussion can go on for hours, circling and probing, sometimes reaching no conclusion, sometimes achieving a moment of insight that feels like breaking through into light. Aristotle proves exceptionally good at this. His mind is quick, logical, systematic. He can spot hidden assumptions, detect logical fallacies, construct arguments with devastating precision. He can take a complex question and break it down into its components, analyze each piece carefully, reassemble them into understanding. He reads Plato's dialogues, those philosophical dramas where Socrates engages with various interlocutors, the early ones where Socrates mostly questions and refutes, exposing the ignorance hidden beneath confident claims. The middle dialogues where Plato's own theories emerge, the Phaedo on the soul's immortality, the Republic on the ideal state, the Symposium on love as the desire for immortal beauty. Perhaps even the later, more difficult dialogues where Plato wrestles with problems in his own system. And Aristotle participates in endless discussions, formal and informal, structured lessons, and spontaneous debates that spring up over meals or while walking the garden paths. What is virtue? Can it be taught? What is knowledge, and how does it differ from mere belief?
What makes an action just? What is the best form of government? Does the soul exist before birth and after death? What is the nature of love? These questions are not abstract exercises. They matter profoundly. How you answer them shapes how you live, what you value, what you pursue. The community at the academy becomes Aristotle's world. These men, and they are all men, women being excluded from formal philosophical education, become his companions, his friends, sometimes his rivals. They study together, eat together, exercise together, argue together late into the night. There is Speusippus, Plato's nephew, who will eventually succeed him, Xenocrates, who will lead the academy after Speusippus, Heraclides of Pontus, interested in astronomy and natural philosophy, and later Theophrastus from Lesbos, who will become Aristotle's closest friend and collaborator. Friendships form through shared intellectual passion. You bond with someone because you have argued together about the nature of justice for 6 hours, testing each other's thinking, pushing each other to be clearer, more rigorous, more honest. These are not casual friendships, but deep connections forged through common pursuit of truth. Plato notices Aristotle. How could he not? Among the students, Aristotle stands out. Not just intelligent, but original. Not just learned, but creative. He doesn't simply absorb what he's taught. He thinks for himself, asks difficult questions, challenges assumptions, develops his own ideas. Ancient sources tell us that Plato called Aristotle the mind of the school, or sometimes the reader because of his voracious appetite for books. In an age when books are rare and expensive, each one copied laboriously by hand, Aristotle apparently spends much of his money building a personal library, scrolls of philosophy, poetry, natural history, mathematics, medicine. If knowledge has been written down, Aristotle wants a copy. His quarters must be cluttered with scrolls, his mind constantly absorbing, analyzing, comparing.
The relationship between Plato and Aristotle develops over the years, from teacher and student towards something more complex. Aristotle admires Plato enormously. How could he not? Plato has created something magnificent, a comprehensive philosophical vision, an institution dedicated to truth-seeking, a method for pursuing wisdom. Plato is the greatest living philosopher, and Aristotle is privileged to study with him. But admiration is not the same as agreement. As Aristotle matures intellectually, as he moves from his 20s into his 30s, doubts begin to form. The theory of forms troubles him. It is elegant, profound, but is it true? These perfect, eternal forms supposedly existing in some transcendent realm, what evidence do we have for them? And even if they exist, how do they relate to the particular things we encounter in the physical world? Plato says particulars participate in forms, that individual horses are horses because they participate in the form of horse itself. But what does participation mean? How does it work? If the form is separate from particulars, how does it make them what they are? Consider a simple example that will bother Aristotle for years: a horse grazing in a field. Plato would say there is the form of horse, perfect and eternal, and this particular horse is merely an imperfect copy, a shadow of the true horse. But Aristotle, trained in observation, looks at that actual horse and thinks, isn't this real horse the primary reality? This specific animal with its particular history, born to specific parents, living its individual life? What explanatory work does this separate form of horse actually do? Or consider the problem of change. The physical world is full of change, obviously and undeniably. Acorns become oak trees, tadpoles become frogs, children become adults, boys become philosophers. This change is real, not illusory, and it follows patterns, has causes, can be understood. But Plato, following the earlier philosopher Parmenides, is suspicious of change. True reality, he thinks, must be unchanging. That's why the forms are eternal and perfect. Yet if true reality is unchanging, how do we explain the obvious fact that things change? These doubts grow slowly. They are not rejections, but questionings, probings, the kind of critical engagement that any good teacher would want from their best student.
This is exactly what Plato values, not blind acceptance, but rigorous thinking, following arguments wherever they lead. Aristotle begins to work out his own positions, ideas that will eventually develop into his mature philosophy, but that are still forming, still in dialogue with Plato's thought. Maybe the forms aren't separate from particular things, but somehow in them as their organizing principle, their essence. Maybe change isn't a barrier to knowledge, but something that can itself be studied and understood, that follows patterns and has causes. Maybe the physical world isn't a mere shadow, but is itself real and worth investigating. If you enjoy these historical stories and want to hear more about the great thinkers who shaped our world, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything. And if you have suggestions for other historical figures you'd like to hear about, leave a comment below. Years pass. Aristotle is no longer a newcomer, but an established member of the community. He's in his 20s, then his 30s. He begins to teach, leading discussions with younger students, developing his own following within the academy. He is known for his clarity, his systematic approach, his ability to organize complex material and make it comprehensible. Life in Athens swirls around them. The city is no longer the dominant power it was in Pericles' day. The Peloponnesian War, which ended before Aristotle was born, exhausted Athens, saw it defeated by Sparta, saw its long walls torn down, and its democracy briefly overthrown by the 30 tyrants. Democracy has been restored, but Athens is diminished, one power among several in a complex Greek world of shifting alliances and constant low-level warfare. Yet Athens remains the cultural center of Greece. The theater festivals continue, new tragedies and comedies premiered every year at the Great Dionysia. The law courts function, democratic and chaotic, with citizen juries deciding cases through rhetoric and argument. The assembly meets on the Pnyx Hill, debating policy, declaring war and peace, honoring heroes and ostracizing dangers. Philosophers of various schools argue in the agora and gymnasiums. Sophists teach rhetoric for fees. Religious festivals mark the turning of seasons. Aristotle is a metic here, a foreign resident, not a citizen. He cannot own property, cannot participate in the assembly, cannot vote on war or peace. He is always, in some sense, an outsider, despite his deep immersion in Athenian intellectual life. His Macedonian origins mark him as different, from a place Athenians consider backward, barely civilized. But in the academy, citizenship matters less. What counts is the quality of your mind, the rigor of your arguments, your devotion to truth-seeking. Here, Aristotle belongs.
He watches as Plato makes his final voyage to Syracuse in 361 BCE. It is Plato's third attempt to advise the tyrant there, Dionysius II, hoping to turn him into the philosopher king described in the Republic, to realize in practice the ideal state that exists in theory. It ends, like the previous attempts, in disappointment and danger. Plato returns disillusioned, having learned, if he didn't know it already, that the real world of politics is resistant to philosophy, that power corrupts, that even the best ideas struggle to take root in the soil of human ambition and vice. Aristotle, watching this, perhaps draws his own conclusions. Perhaps he begins to think that philosophy's relationship to politics is more complex than Plato imagines, that understanding how states actually function is as important as envisioning ideal states that may never exist. The years accumulate: 367, 365, 360, 355, 350. 20 years Aristotle spends at the academy, from age 17 or 18 to age 37. 20 years of studying, teaching, thinking, writing early works that are now lost to us. 20 years of walking these paths, arguing in these gardens, reading in the library, living in this community devoted to philosophy. And then, in 347 BCE, everything changes. Plato dies. He is 80 or 81 years old. His death, when it comes, is peaceful. He dies in his sleep at a wedding feast, or so one story goes. He has lived a long life, witnessed the rise and fall of Athens' power, survived 2 attempts at tyranny, traveled widely, taught generations of students, written dialogues that will be read as long as humans care about wisdom. For Aristotle, now 37 years old, it must be an earthquake. Plato has been the great presence in his life for 2 decades, the teacher he admired even when he disagreed with him, the mind against which he tested his own ideas, the reason he came to Athens in the first place. The academy is Plato's creation, shaped by his vision, held together by his authority. Now that presence is gone. The funeral is held with appropriate honors. Students and colleagues grieve. Athens honors one of its greatest citizens. The academy must continue, but the question is, under whose leadership? Aristotle is the obvious choice in many ways. He is the most brilliant philosopher in the institution, respected by students and colleagues alike, has been there longer than almost anyone, has developed his own philosophical positions while remaining engaged with the academy's mission. But he is not chosen. Instead, leadership passes to Speusippus, Plato's nephew. The reasons are complex, tangled in politics and philosophy. Aristotle is not an Athenian citizen. He cannot legally own property, which complicates institutional leadership. But more importantly, his philosophical direction has diverged significantly from Plato's orthodoxy. Speusippus, though less brilliant than Aristotle, is more faithful to the theory of forms, more committed to Plato's otherworldly vision. We can only imagine Aristotle's feelings, disappointment certainly, to be passed over after 20 years, to see your intellectual achievements subordinated to family connection and philosophical conservatism. Perhaps hurt, perhaps anger, perhaps also relief. Relief at not having to maintain institutional orthodoxy, relief at being free to pursue his own path without the weight of leadership. Whatever his emotions, his decision is swift and clear. Aristotle leaves. He leaves the academy where he spent his entire adult life, where he became a philosopher, where he formed his deepest friendships and developed his most important ideas. He packs his books, arranges his affairs, says his farewells. Within months of Plato's death, perhaps within weeks, Aristotle departs from Athens. He is not abandoning philosophy, far from it. He is leaving to become not just a student of philosophy, but a philosopher in his own right, to develop his own system, to build his own legacy. But where will he go? What will he do? At age 37, after spending more than half his life in one place, how does one begin again? An invitation arrives from across the Aegean, from a place connected to his past, offering a future he could not have anticipated.
The invitation comes from Hermias, ruler of Atarneus and the surrounding region of Assos on the coast of Asia Minor. Aristotle knows this place. It is where he spent part of his youth under the guardianship of Proxenus, where he was educated after his parents died. The connection makes the invitation feel almost like destiny, like a circle closing. But Hermias himself is the more remarkable part of the story. He was born a slave, or so the accounts tell us, in a world where slavery is as natural as the rising sun. Through some combination of intelligence, ambition, and fortune, he gained his freedom, acquired an education, and rose to become the tyrant, the ruler of Atarneus and several nearby cities. In the Greek world, where birth determines so much, where aristocrats look down on merchants and everyone looks down on slaves, this is an extraordinary achievement. More extraordinary still, Hermias is not just another petty tyrant concerned only with power and wealth. He's a philosopher, or at least a devoted lover of philosophy. He studied with members of Plato's academy, absorbed their teachings, and dreamed, as Plato did, of being or creating the philosopher king, the ruler who governs with wisdom and justice rather than mere force. Now, in 347 BCE, with Plato newly dead and the academy in transition, Hermias invites Aristotle and several other philosophers to come to Assos. Come establish a philosophical school here. Come teach, research, continue your work under generous patronage in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom and support. For Aristotle, the timing could not be better. He needs to leave Athens, not just because of disappointment over the academy's leadership, though that stings, but because the political situation is becoming uncomfortable. Athens and Macedonia are increasingly at odds. Philip II, the Macedonian king, is systematically bringing Greek city-states under his control, and Athens resists, fears, hates this northern power threatening their autonomy. Aristotle, the Macedonian, former student of the dead Plato, passed over for leadership. Athens holds too much disappointment and too much danger. So he accepts. He gathers his books, his notes, his belongings accumulated over 20 years. He says goodbye to friends who are staying. The academy will continue under Speusippus, will remain an important institution. But Aristotle's path lies elsewhere now. He boards a ship in Piraeus, sails east across the Aegean, retracing in reverse the journey he made 20 years earlier as a teenager coming to study. But everything is different now. Then he was a student seeking teachers. Now he is a mature philosopher, 37 years old, carrying 2 decades of intensive study and teaching, ready to develop his own philosophical program. Several other philosophers from the academy join him. Xenocrates, who will eventually return to Athens and lead the academy himself. Theophratus from Lesbos, who is becoming Aristotle's closest intellectual companion. Others whose names have been lost to time. They are founding a new philosophical community, a satellite of the academy, but independent, free to explore ideas without institutional constraints. Assos is perched dramatically on a volcanic outcrop overlooking the Aegean, with spectacular views across to the island of Lesbos just a few miles offshore. It is smaller than Athens, but prosperous, well governed under Hermias's rule. The city has walls, temples, an agora, a theater carved into the hillside, and Hermias provides the philosophers with space to meet and teach, resources to continue their work, the support needed for serious intellectual life. For Aristotle, the relationship between Hermias and Aristotle develops quickly from patron and client into genuine friendship. Here is someone who rose from nothing to rule cities, who values learning for its own sake, who is both a practical statesman and an intellectual. Hermias is perhaps a decade older than Aristotle, old enough to have experienced much, but young enough to be vigorous, active, engaged with the world. They talk late into the night about philosophy and politics, about the challenges of governance, about whether Plato's vision of the philosopher king can be realized. Hermias is living proof that extraordinary individuals can rise from humble origins, can transcend the circumstances of their birth. He is perhaps the closest thing to a philosopher-ruler that Aristotle has encountered outside the pages of Plato's Republic. And there is someone else in Hermias's household that will change Aristotle's life. Her name is Pythias. She is Hermias's niece, or perhaps his adopted daughter. The sources are unclear about the exact relationship, as they are so often unclear about women's lives. What matters is that she is part of Hermias's family, educated and cultured, moving in the intellectual circle that gathers around the ruler. Aristotle and Pythias begin spending time together. We can imagine them in conversation about philosophy, about literature, about life, walking along the cliff-top paths above the sea, sitting in gardens as the sun sets over the water, getting to know each other not through formal courtship rituals, but through the natural interaction of people who share a world and interests.
Aristotle is nearly 40 now. He has devoted his entire adult life to philosophy, living the celibate existence of an academy student focused entirely on intellectual pursuits. But he is also human, capable of love, of wanting companionship, of desiring a life that includes more than just books and arguments. Pythias is younger. How much younger, we don't know. Ancient sources tell us almost nothing about her as a person, giving us only the barest facts of her existence. But the evidence suggests she is not simply a passive presence in Aristotle's life. She comes from an intellectual household, has been exposed to philosophical discussions, is capable of understanding and engaging with Aristotle's work. They marry. It is 345 or 344 BCE.
Hermias gives his blessing, perhaps even arranges it, seeing the benefit of tying Aristotle more closely to his family and court. For Aristotle, it represents a new chapter, no longer just a philosopher, but a husband, beginning to build a household and family. The wedding would follow Greek customs, sacrifices to the gods, especially Hera, who presides over marriage, a feast with family and friends, the bride veiled, led in procession from her father's house to her new home, rituals connecting this couple to the long tradition of Greek marriages, to the social fabric that holds communities together. What is their marriage like? We have so little to go on, but Aristotle will later write about marriage in his Ethics and Politics, describing it ideally as a partnership of mutual affection and virtue, each partner contributing according to their nature and abilities, working together toward a good life. Is he describing theory or experience? Perhaps both. Perhaps Pythias is not just his wife, but his intellectual companion, someone who understands his work and supports it. During these years in Assos, likely about 3 years from 347 to 345 or 344 BCE, Aristotle's work takes on a new character. He is no longer primarily responding to and critiquing Plato's ideas. He is building his own philosophical system, developing his own answers to fundamental questions. And, crucially, he is turning his attention more systematically to the natural world, to the empirical study of living things that will become one of his greatest contributions to human knowledge. The coast of Asia Minor is perfect for this work. The Aegean teems with marine life, fish of countless varieties, octopi with their remarkable intelligence and camouflage abilities, shellfish clinging to rocks, sponges that blur the line between plant and animal, sea urchins, starfish, creatures bizarre and beautiful. The shoreline provides tide pools where organisms can be observed in their natural habitat. The fish markets provide fresh specimens for dissection and study. Aristotle begins the patient work of observation that will eventually produce his biological treatises. He examines fish, noting their internal structure, their methods of reproduction, their behaviors. He discovers that some fish, like sharks and rays, give birth to live young rather than laying eggs. He observes dolphins and realizes they are fundamentally different from fish. They breathe air, give birth to live young, nurse their babies with milk. They are more like land animals than fish, despite living in the sea. He collects specimens, dissects them carefully, notes their anatomy, the heart and how it connects to blood vessels, the digestive system and how it processes food, the reproductive organs and how they differ between males and females, between species that lay eggs and those that give birth, the gills of fish and how they extract oxygen from water. He categorizes organisms, looking for natural groupings, seeking principles of classification that reflect real similarities and differences rather than superficial appearances. What makes a fish a fish? What makes a mammal, even before the word mammal exists? How should we group the vast diversity of life into meaningful categories? This is philosophy through observation, through careful attention to the physical world. Plato would have been skeptical. Why waste time on constantly changing physical things when you should be contemplating eternal forms? But for Aristotle, this is a way of understanding reality itself. Each organism exists for a purpose, has a nature that it strives to fulfill, reveals in its structure and function the organizing principles of life itself. He teaches during these years, gathering students, developing his ideas through dialogue and instruction. He writes, or begins to write, early versions of works that will eventually become his biological treatises. The philosophical school at Assos may be small compared to Plato's academy, but it is serious, productive, a genuine center of learning. Then, around 345 or 344 BCE, Aristotle and his companions move. Not far, just across the narrow strait to the island of Lesbos, to the city of Mytilene. Theophrastus has family connections there, and the island offers even better opportunities for biological research than Assos. Lesbos has a large, shallow lagoon on its eastern coast, Pyrrha Lagoon, that is perfect for studying marine life. The calm, protected waters harbor countless species. The mudflats at low tide reveal organisms otherwise hidden. The variety of habitats, rocky shores, sandy beaches, seagrass beds, support different ecological communities. Here, Aristotle's biological research reaches its highest intensity. He spends hours, days, weeks observing and collecting. He enlists local fishermen as collaborators, learning from their practical knowledge of the sea's inhabitants, asking them to bring him unusual specimens, to tell him about seasonal patterns of fish behavior, about breeding and migration. He studies the development of animals from conception to birth to maturity. He cracks open chicken eggs at different stages of incubation, carefully observing the development of the embryo, noting how the heart begins beating before other organs form, how the chick gradually takes shape inside the egg. This work is systematic, almost modern in its approach, not a few casual observations, but a sustained research program, attempting to understand the principles of animal development. He observes the mating and reproduction of sea creatures. He notes that some octopi die after reproducing, as if reproduction exhausts their life force. He watches how different fish care for their eggs or abandon them. He sees that some animals are more developed at birth, while others, like human babies, are helpless and require long periods of care. He is trying to understand not just what each creature is, but why it is that way, what purpose each structure serves, how form relates to function. Why do fish have gills and scales? Because they live in water, and these structures serve the purpose of extracting oxygen and providing protection. Why do birds have wings and hollow bones? Because these structures serve the purpose of flight. Everything in nature, Aristotle believes, has a purpose, a telos, the final cause that explains its form and function. His daughter, Pythias, is born during these years, named for her mother, as is common in Greek culture. Aristotle is now not just a philosopher and husband, but a father, responsible for a child's life and upbringing. The household expands. Life becomes more complex, more grounded in the everyday concerns of family and domestic management, even as his intellectual work continues. But then disaster strikes, sudden and terrible. Hermias, back in Assos, has been involved in complex political maneuvering. He is allied with Athens and other Greek cities, and he has been secretly plotting against Persian power in the region. The Persian Empire controls most of Asia Minor, and Hermias' independence has always been precarious, maintained through careful diplomacy and playing different powers against each other. But his plotting is discovered. A Persian general named Mentor, who knows Hermias from years past, tricks him into a meeting under the pretense of negotiation. Hermias goes, perhaps trusting in old friendship or in diplomatic immunity. It is a trap. Mentor captures him and sends him to the Persian king, Artaxerxes III, at the imperial capital of Susa. Hermias is tortured, pressed to reveal his co-conspirators, to give up the names of those plotting against Persian power, to betray his allies. The torture is systematic, brutal. The Persians want information and are willing to inflict any pain to get it. But Hermias refuses. Despite the agony, despite the certainty that he will die, he will not betray those who trusted him. Finally, when it becomes clear he will reveal nothing, he is executed. Crucifixion, a death reserved for slaves and rebels, deliberately humiliating for a man who rose from slavery to rule cities. He dies slowly, painfully, far from home. When news reaches Lesbos, it devastates Aristotle. Hermias was not just his patron, but his friend, perhaps the closest thing to Plato's philosopher king he had encountered in the real world, a man who rose from nothing through merit, who valued wisdom, who tried to govern justly. And now he is dead, brutally executed by the Persian Empire's machinery of torture and terror. Aristotle's response to this grief is a poem, a paean, a hymn of praise. It is one of the few pieces of Aristotle's writing that survives in his own words rather than in lecture notes or student compilations. The poem honors Hermias, calling him a man whom it is not lawful for the base even to praise, celebrating his virtue and his refusal to betray his friends even under torture. This poem will cause Aristotle trouble years later. Critics will claim it treats Hermias as if he were a god, that such honors are impious, blasphemous. But in the moment, it is simply grief finding expression, the attempt to honor a friend who died with extraordinary courage. But grief compounds grief.
Pythias, Aristotle's wife, falls ill. We don't know what illness strikes her. The sources, as always, are frustratingly vague about such details. Perhaps it is a disease that sweeps through the region, one of those epidemics that ancient medicine cannot combat. Perhaps it is related to childbirth. Their daughter is still young, and complications from pregnancy and delivery kill many women in the ancient world. Perhaps it is something else entirely. Whatever the cause, Pythias dies young. Aristotle has been married only a few years, just long enough to know the happiness of partnership, not long enough for a lifetime together. Now he is a widower, with a young daughter to raise, mourning both his wife and his friend within a short span of time.
The losses must be crushing. At age 40 or so, having just established a new life away from Athens, having married and started a family, having found a patron and friend who supported his work, suddenly it is all torn away. Pythias dead, Hermias dead, the philosophical community in Assos no longer viable, too close to Persian power, too dangerous in the aftermath of Hermias' execution. What does one do in the face of such loss? Aristotle buries his grief in work, perhaps, continues his research, his teaching, his writing, cares for his daughter, maintains the philosophical community on Lesbos, even as the shadow of recent deaths hangs over it. He will remember Pythias for the rest of his life. Years later, when writing his will, he will ask to be buried beside her, showing that even after remarrying, even after building a new life, his first wife holds a special place in his memory and affection. But life, as it must, continues. There is research to complete, students to teach, a daughter to raise. There are questions still to answer, knowledge still to pursue. Aristotle is resilient, dedicated, perhaps driven by the conviction that understanding the world is the best response to its tragedies. And then, in 343 or 342 BCE, another letter arrives, another invitation that will redirect his life again. This one comes from much farther north, from Macedonia, from King Philip II himself. Philip is transforming Macedonia from a backward kingdom into the dominant military power of Greece. He is Aristotle's contemporary, just a few years older, a brilliant general and cunning politician. He has conquered or made alliances with most of northern Greece and is systematically extending his influence southward to the alarm of cities like Athens and Thebes. Philip has a son, a boy named Alexander, now about 13 years old. The boy is bright, energetic, showing signs of extraordinary abilities. Philip wants the best education for his son, the education that will prepare him to be a king, perhaps even the king who will finally unite Greece and lead it against Persia in the revenge campaign that every Greek dreams of, but no one has been powerful enough to attempt. And the best philosopher in the Greek world, Philip decides, is Aristotle, his fellow Macedonian, the son of his father's physician, the brilliant mind who studied with Plato but has now established his own reputation, a man who has lived in the Greek world but is not beholden to any Greek city-state, who can bring Hellenic culture to the Macedonian court without the prejudices of an Athenian or Theban. Philip's invitation is both an honor and a command. You do not refuse the king of Macedon, especially when you are yourself Macedonian by birth. And there is something appealing about the prospect, too, the chance to shape a young prince's mind at the most formative age, to see if philosophy can indeed influence a future ruler, to test, in practice, some of the ideas about education and statecraft that Aristotle has been developing. So Aristotle makes his decision. He will go to Macedonia. He will become the tutor to the king's son. He will leave behind the biological research, the philosophical school on Lesbos, the life he has been building in the Eastern Aegean. He packs his belongings once more. His books, always the books. His notes from years of research, observations of marine life, philosophical treatises in progress, teaching materials. He makes arrangements for his daughter's care. Perhaps she travels with him. Perhaps she stays with family. He says goodbye to Theophrastus and his other companions who will continue the work on Lesbos. And he journeys north, back towards the land of his birth, to the Macedonian court at Pella, to meet the teenage prince who will become Alexander the Great, to begin the next chapter of his extraordinary life. The royal court at Pella is a world utterly different from the philosophical gardens of Athens or the quiet coastal towns where Aristotle has spent recent years. This is Macedonia, a kingdom, not a democracy. Power flows from the king, and everything revolves around his person, his will, his ambitions. The court is a place of warriors and nobles, of hunting parties and military training, of feasting and drinking that can turn violent, of constant jockeying for position and favor. Philip II sits at the center of this world. He is 43 years old when Aristotle arrives, battle-scarred and formidable. He lost his right eye to an arrow at the siege of Methano, and the wound gives his face a fierce, asymmetrical appearance. But this is no barbarian warrior king, despite what Athenians like Demosthenes claim in their speeches. Philip is cultured, sophisticated, educated. He admires Greek civilization, has worked to bring Greek culture to Macedonia, sponsors artists and poets, collects Greek art and literature. More importantly, Philip is a strategic genius. He has transformed Macedonia from a backward kingdom constantly threatened by its neighbors into the dominant military power of the Greek world. He has reformed the army, creating the famous Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissas, pikes 18 feet long that can hold off cavalry and break infantry formations. He has conquered or made allies of most of northern Greece, and he has a vision to unite all Greeks under Macedonian leadership and lead them in the great revenge campaign against Persia, the war to punish the empire that invaded Greece in his grandfather's time. But Philip also understands that military power alone is not enough. He needs legitimacy, needs to transform Macedonia from a conquering power into the acknowledged leader of Greek civilization. And part of that transformation means educating his son in the best traditions of Greek learning. Alexander is 13 when Aristotle arrives, just entering the age when a Greek boy's serious education would traditionally begin. He is small for his age, compact and muscular, with an intensity that seems to radiate from him. His eyes are different colors, one blue, one brown, a condition called heterochromia that gives him a striking, almost otherworldly appearance. His hair is reddish blonde, unusual among Greeks and Macedonians, and he has a habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when he thinks deeply. Already he shows the qualities that will define him: fierce intelligence that devours knowledge hungrily, boundless physical energy that drives him to excel at every martial skill, riding, wrestling, javelin throwing, a competitive nature that cannot bear to lose at anything, a love of glory and honor that seems lifted straight from the pages of Homer, and a certain recklessness, a willingness to take enormous risks for the chance at immortal fame. Philip assigns them a place to work away from the bustle of the court, the sanctuary of the nymphs at Mysa, about 20 miles from Pella. It is a peaceful spot, with gardens and springs sacred to the nymphs, buildings that can serve as classrooms, removed enough from the capital to allow for focused study. Here Aristotle will teach not just Alexander, but a small group of other boys, the sons of Macedonian nobles, who will grow up to be Alexander's closest companions and generals. Among them is Ptolemy, who will eventually rule Egypt and found the Ptolemaic dynasty that lasts 3 centuries. Hephaestion, who will become Alexander's dearest friend and perhaps lover, whose death will devastate him. Cassander, son of Antipater, Philip's most trusted general, who will eventually murder Alexander's family and seize power. Nearchus, who will command Alexander's fleet. Others whose names will be written in the history of Alexander's conquests. But for now, they are just boys, and Aristotle's task is to turn them into educated men, Greek in culture, even if Macedonian by birth. What does Aristotle teach the future conqueror of the known world? Homer certainly features prominently. The Iliad especially, the story of Achilles, the greatest warrior who chose glory and a short life over safety and obscurity. Alexander loves the Iliad passionately, knows it by heart, sees himself in Achilles. He believes he is descended from Achilles through his mother Olympias's line, that the blood of heroes flows in his veins. Aristotle prepares a special edition of the Iliad for Alexander, corrected and annotated, which the boy will carry with him throughout his campaigns, keeping it in a precious casket under his pillow alongside his dagger.
But Aristotle teaches Homer critically, not just as entertainment, but as a source of moral and political wisdom. They analyze the characters, their virtues and flaws, their choices and consequences. What makes Achilles great but also tragic? His excellence in battle, his loyalty to his companions, but also his pride, his rage that leads to disaster for the Greeks. What kind of leader is Agamemnon? Powerful but flawed, unable to manage the egos and passions of his coalition. What is Odysseus's cunning, and when does cleverness become deception? These are not just literary questions, but lessons in leadership and ethics. Alexander is learning about the burdens of command, about how leaders must balance competing demands, about how passion and pride can destroy even the greatest men.
Aristotle teaches rhetoric and persuasion, essential skills for anyone who will need to lead men, inspire armies, negotiate with allies and enemies. How to construct a convincing argument, how to read an audience and adapt your appeal to their values and concerns, how to use emotion and reason together to move people to action. Alexander proves a natural speaker, able to inspire tremendous loyalty and courage with his words. He teaches logic and clear thinking, how to construct valid arguments, how to identify fallacies and weak reasoning, how to think through problems systematically. This is the systematic logic that Aristotle has been developing, the rules of inference that will eventually be codified in his Organon. For a future general and king, the ability to think clearly under pressure, to analyze situations accurately, to reason from evidence to conclusion, these are not abstract skills, but practical necessities. He teaches ethics and politics. What is the good life for a human being? What is virtue and how is it acquired? What makes a government just? What is the purpose of the state? These questions that Plato explored, that Aristotle has been developing his own answers to, are now taught to a boy who will one day rule an empire larger than any the world has seen. Aristotle's ethics emphasizes the mean between extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and extravagance. The virtuous person has learned through practice and habituation to find the right balance in action and emotion. This is practical wisdom, not abstract theory, the ability to judge in particular situations what the right action is. Does Alexander absorb these lessons? Perhaps partially. He will be extraordinarily courageous, but also reckless, willing to risk his life in ways that terrify his generals. He will be generous to a fault with his companions, but also ruthless with enemies. The mean is a difficult target, and Alexander tends toward extremes. Aristotle teaches natural philosophy, the nature of the physical world, the causes of phenomena, the classification of living things. He shows Alexander the results of his biological research, explains how different creatures are adapted to their environments, discusses the principles that organize the natural world. Alexander develops a genuine fascination with natural history that will persist throughout his life. During his campaigns, he will send back specimens from distant lands, exotic animals, unusual plants, descriptions of geography to Aristotle for study. He will order his soldiers to preserve unusual creatures they encounter, to note down observations of strange phenomena. In this way, Alexander's conquests will advance human knowledge of natural history, expanding the catalog of known species far beyond the Mediterranean world. Aristotle teaches geography and ethnography, describing the known world and the peoples who inhabit it, the Greeks and their achievements, the Persians and their vast empire, the Egyptians with their ancient civilization, the barbarian tribes to the north and west, the mysterious lands to the east, India, Bactria, regions known only through travelers' tales and hearsay. This geographical education will prove directly relevant when Alexander begins his campaigns. He will march through lands Aristotle described, encounter peoples Aristotle taught him about. Though Alexander will go far beyond what his teacher knew, pushing into regions no Greek had reached, the foundation of understanding about different cultures and lands comes from these lessons at Mysa. And perhaps most importantly, Aristotle teaches by example, the example of a life devoted to learning, of curiosity about everything, of the belief that the world is intelligible and that human reason can comprehend it. The message is clear. Knowledge is valuable. Understanding matters. Learning is not just for scholars, but for anyone who wants to live well and act effectively. The relationship between teacher and student is complex, layered with genuine mutual respect, but also fundamental differences in temperament and values. They are not close in age as student and teacher often are. Aristotle is in his early 40s, Alexander in his early teens, a full generation apart. Aristotle has spent his life in study and contemplation. Alexander can barely sit still, is always ready for action, for physical challenge, for competition. Aristotle embodies what he will later write about. The contemplative life is the highest form of human existence. The life of philosophy and understanding is the most divine thing humans can achieve. But Alexander embodies something else, the life of glory and achievement, of action rather than contemplation, of leaving a mark on history so deep it can never be erased. Do they argue about this? Do they have late-night conversations about what kind of life is worth living? We can only imagine. But there must be a tension there, a fundamental divergence in what they value most deeply, even as they respect each other's excellence in their respective domains. The ancient sources suggest that Aristotle tries to instill in Alexander a respect for Greek culture, a belief in Greek superiority over barbarians, a vision of himself as the champion of Hellenism spreading civilization to the backward peoples of the world. Whether he succeeds in this is debatable. Alexander will eventually adopt Persian customs that horrify Greeks, will marry Persian princesses and encourage his soldiers to do the same, will envision an empire that blends Greek and Eastern elements in ways that would have shocked any traditional Greek philosopher.
But Aristotle does give Alexander something crucial, an intellectual framework for understanding the world, a systematic way of approaching problems, a respect for knowledge and learning that will lead Alexander to found cities with libraries, to sponsor scientific observations, to see himself as not just a conqueror, but a civilizer. The tutorship lasts about 3 years, from roughly 343 to 340 BCE. By the time Alexander is 16, his formal education is complete. Philip makes him regent while campaigning elsewhere, and Alexander immediately distinguishes himself. He suppresses a rebellion of the Medai tribe, defeats them in battle, and founds a city called Alexandropolis, his first city, though many more will bear his name. He is ready to begin the career that will make him a legend. As for Aristotle, he remains in Macedonia for a few more years, though his primary teaching duties are complete. Philip values his counsel, consults him on various matters, education policy, cultural affairs, perhaps even political strategy. The relationship is cordial, mutually beneficial. Philip shows his gratitude in a tangible way. He rebuilds Stagira, Aristotle's birthplace, which had been destroyed in earlier wars between Macedonia and the Greek cities. He repopulates it, restores it as a functioning city. For Aristotle, this gesture means everything. His childhood home brought back from destruction, a piece of his past restored. But Aristotle is not really a courtier. His heart is elsewhere, in philosophy, in research, in teaching serious students rather than managing court politics. The Macedonian court, with its hunting parties and drinking bouts, its constant military preparations, its focus on conquest and glory, is not his natural habitat. He participates, fulfills his obligations, maintains good relations with Philip and Alexander, but he is marking time, waiting for the right moment to return to what he does best. Life at court means witnessing the complexity and danger of Macedonian royal politics. Philip's marriage to Olympias, Alexander's mother, is troubled. Olympias is fierce, passionate, possessive of her son, convinced of his divine destiny. She practices mystery religions, keeps snakes as sacred animals, claims descent from Achilles.
Philip, meanwhile, takes other wives in the polygamous tradition of Macedonian kings. The court is full of intrigue, competing factions, dangerous ambitions barely contained by Philip's authority. Alexander grows from teenager into young man, proves himself repeatedly in battle at his father's side. At 18, he commands the cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip decisively defeats Athens and Thebes, finally establishing Macedonian dominance over Greece. Alexander's charge breaks the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 warriors, paired male lovers fighting side by side in the battle's climactic moment. Greece is now subject to Macedonia, whether by alliance or submission. Aristotle watches all this from the margins. He is part of the court, but not truly of it. He sees Alexander becoming the warrior and leader Philip intended, sees the boy he taught at Mysa transforming into someone both magnificent and terrifying, someone whose ambition seems boundless. And then, in 336 BCE, everything changes in a moment of shocking violence. Philip is at Aegae, the old Macedonian capital, for the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra. It is a grand celebration, with envoys from all over Greece, elaborate ceremonies, theatrical performances. Philip enters the theater in the morning, walking in procession, surrounded by his companions and guards. He is at the height of his power, about to launch the invasion of Persia, about to realize the dream of revenge against the empire that invaded Greece generations earlier. A man named Pausanias approaches, one of Philip's own bodyguards, a member of his intimate circle. Before anyone can react, Pausanias draws a knife and stabs Philip in the chest. The king falls, dead before he hits the ground. Pausanias tries to flee, but is killed immediately by other guards. The motives remain murky even today. Was it a personal grudge? Pausanias had been humiliated by Philip and denied justice? Was it a conspiracy involving larger political forces? Did Olympias, Philip's estranged wife, manipulate events? Did the Persians, facing invasion, arrange the assassination? The ancient sources offered different theories, but certainty is impossible. What matters is that Philip is dead, struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph, and Alexander, just 20 years old, becomes king of Macedon. It is a supremely dangerous moment. Macedonia's enemies sense weakness. The Greek cities that Philip conquered, especially Thebes, immediately rebel, thinking a young king untested can be overthrown. The northern tribes test Macedonia's borders. Even within Macedonia, there are rival claimants, potential challenges to Alexander's succession. Alexander moves with stunning speed and ruthlessness to secure his power. Rival claimants are eliminated, executed, or driven into exile. The northern tribes are crushed in a lightning campaign, and when Thebes rebels, Alexander makes an example that will never be forgotten. He besieges the city, takes it by storm, and razes it to the ground. The inhabitants are killed or sold into slavery. One of Greece's great cities, home to Pindar and the Sacred Band, is erased from the map as a warning to all others who might resist.
Athens, which had encouraged the rebellion, submits immediately. They send an embassy begging forgiveness, offering loyalty. Alexander, showing the political cunning that will serve him well, accepts graciously. He needs Greece quiescent while he pursues his real goal, conquering Persia. For Aristotle, watching Alexander's accession and consolidation of power, the feelings must be complicated. This is his former student, the boy he taught at Mysa, now a king commanding armies, making decisions of life and death for entire cities. Has philosophy shaped him at all? Or has Alexander become simply what his nature and circumstances made him, a conqueror, a warrior king in the tradition of Achilles and Heracles? And with Philip dead, with Alexander focused entirely on preparing for his Persian campaign, there is little reason for Aristotle to remain in Macedonia. He's been away from the center of Greek philosophical life for nearly a decade. He is now nearly 50 years old, entering the stage of life the Greeks consider most appropriate for teaching and sharing accumulated wisdom. The question is whether Athens will welcome him. The political situation is delicate.
Athens hates and fears Macedonian power. Aristotle is known to be closely connected to the royal house. He taught Alexander, was honored by Philip. To return to Athens as Alexander prepares to launch his invasion might seem like collaboration with the enemy. But Aristotle has something in his favor. He is not an Athenian citizen, cannot own property, poses no political threat. He is simply a philosopher wanting to teach. And Athens, despite its political hostility to Macedonia, remains committed to intellectual freedom, remains proud of being the center of Greek learning. In 335 BCE, as Alexander prepares to cross into Asia, Aristotle makes his decision. He will return to Athens. Not as a student this time, not to join an existing institution, but to found his own school, to teach his own philosophy, to build his own legacy. He is nearly 50 years old. He has spent 20 years at Plato's academy, absorbing and then questioning that tradition. He has spent years in research and teaching at Assos and Lesbos, developing his own philosophical approach. He has spent time educating a prince who is now a conquering king. He has experienced love and loss, friendship and grief, patronage and independence. Now he is ready for the culminating phase of his life, the years when everything he has learned and developed will come together in a final burst of extraordinary productivity. He gathers his belongings, always the books, the precious library he has accumulated over decades, his notes from biological research, his philosophical treatises in various stages of completion. He makes arrangements for his household. His daughter Pythias is growing up, will eventually need a marriage arranged. He has formed a relationship with a woman named Herpyllis from his hometown of Stagira, who will be his companion for the rest of his life. And he makes the journey south, back to Athens, back to the city where he spent his youth and early adulthood, ready to establish himself as not just a philosopher, but the philosopher, ready to create an institution that will rival the academy itself, ready to write the works that will shape human thought for 2,000 years. The Lyceum awaits.
Athens, in 335 BCE, is a city living under the shadow of Macedonian power, a shadow made darker and more ominous by recent events. Just the previous year, Thebes rebelled, and Alexander responded with shocking brutality, razing one of Greece's great cities, killing or enslaving its inhabitants, leaving nothing but rubble and memory as a warning to all others. Athens got the message. The demos may seethe with resentment. Orators like Demosthenes may fulminate in private against the Macedonian tyrant, but Athens remains quiet, subject, waiting. Into this tense atmosphere returns Aristotle, philosopher and former tutor to that very Macedonian king whose name now inspires fear throughout Greece. He cannot take over the academy. The reasons are multiple, layered, practical, and philosophical. First, he is not a citizen of Athens. He is a metic, a foreign resident, and Athenian law forbids non-citizens from owning property. The academy, as an institution with land and buildings, belongs to its citizen members. Aristotle cannot legally be one of them, no matter how long he lived there, no matter how much he contributed to its intellectual life. But even if the legal obstacles could be overcome, there are philosophical reasons. The academy is still there, still operating under Xenocrates now, the man who succeeded Speusippus, who in turn succeeded Plato. The academy remains committed to Plato's philosophy, to the theory of forms, to the otherworldly vision that Aristotle has decisively moved away from. To take over the academy would mean either conforming to Platonic orthodoxy or transforming an institution against its own nature. Neither option appeals to Aristotle. So he establishes his school elsewhere, in another public space on the opposite side of Athens, the Lyceum, a gymnasium and public ground dedicated to Apollo Lycaeus, named for the god's epithet as wolf slayer. It lies east of the city, while the academy is to the northwest. Like the academy, it has gardens and covered walkways, trees providing shade, open spaces for exercise and contemplation. These covered walkways, called peripatos in Greek, will give Aristotle's school its nickname, the Peripatetic School. The
the school of those who walk while they philosophize. The name captures something essential about Aristotle's method. He teaches while walking up and down these paths, students following, the rhythm of walking somehow helping the rhythm of thought, the physical movement mirroring and perhaps facilitating the mental movement from question to answer, from problem to solution. Imagine it. Aristotle at the center, now nearly 50 years old, graying but vigorous, his mind as sharp as ever. Students around him, some walking beside him, some following behind, all listening intently as he lectures, as he poses questions, as he works through philosophical problems step by step. The dappled shade of plane trees overhead, the sound of footsteps on gravel paths, birds singing, the distant noise of the city, and in the midst of it all, philosophy happening in real time, ideas being articulated, arguments being constructed, truth being pursued through rational inquiry. But the Lyceum is more than just a place to walk and talk. Aristotle envisions something more systematic, more organized, more comprehensive than what existed at the academy. He wants to create a true research institution, a place where all knowledge can be gathered, classified, studied, and expanded upon. Not just philosophy in the narrow sense, but all forms of systematic inquiry into reality. He begins collecting books, a massive undertaking in an age when every book must be copied by hand, when papyrus is expensive and scribes are scarce. But Aristotle has always valued books, has been accumulating them since his student days. Now he builds a library that becomes the first great collection of its kind, a model for the famous library that will be established in Alexandria in the next generation. Texts on philosophy, natural history, politics, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography, literature. If knowledge has been written down, if understanding has been preserved in writing, Aristotle wants a copy. The library is not just for personal study. It is a resource for the entire school, a shared repository of knowledge that students can consult, that researchers can use to check facts and compare theories. It represents a new way of organizing intellectual life, not just individual thinkers pursuing questions in isolation, but a community of scholars with access to accumulated knowledge, able to build on what previous generations discovered. Aristotle organizes research programs, setting projects for groups of students to work on collaboratively under his direction. One major project involves collecting and analyzing the constitutions of Greek city-states. Teams of students gather information about how different cities are governed, their laws, their institutions, their political structures. Eventually, they compile descriptions and analyses of 158 different political systems, comparing them systematically, looking for patterns, trying to understand what makes governments stable or unstable, just or unjust, effective or dysfunctional.
This is empirical political science before the term exists, not just abstract theorizing about ideal states, but careful observation and classification of how states actually function. Only one of these constitutional studies survives, the Constitution of Athens, but the ancient sources tell us there were many more, covering cities throughout the Greek world. Other teams work on natural history, continuing and expanding the biological research Aristotle began in Assos and Lesbos. They collect observations of animals and plants, catalog behaviors and characteristics, seek principles of organization and classification. They study the heavens, tracking the movements of stars and planets, trying to understand the structure of the cosmos. This is something genuinely new in the history of human thought, not just philosophers pursuing questions as individuals, but organized collaborative research. Not just speculation and argument, but systematic collection and analysis of data. The Lyceum becomes a prototype for the research university, though that institution won't fully develop until much later. And Aristotle himself stands at the center of it all, extraordinarily productive, writing works that will shape human thought for the next 2 millennia. But before we explore those works, we should note the personal dimension of these years. Aristotle is not just a philosopher, but a human being, building a life that includes more than just intellectual work. He has formed a relationship with a woman named Herpyllis. She comes from Stagira, Aristotle's hometown. Perhaps she was part of his household for years. Perhaps they knew each other from childhood. Perhaps she came to him after Philip rebuilt the city. The exact nature of their relationship is somewhat unclear. Later sources, writing in Roman times with Roman concepts, call her his concubine or mistress, but these terms don't quite capture what a relationship might be in the more fluid social world of classical Greece. What matters is that Herpyllis and Aristotle form a partnership, a household, a life together. She manages domestic affairs while he pursues his intellectual work. She bears him a son, whom they name Nicomachus after Aristotle's father, a way of honoring his memory, of connecting this new life to the past. Young Nicomachus grows up surrounded by philosophy, by books and learned discussions, by students coming and going from the Lyceum. He shows intellectual promise, is clearly his father's son in more than name. Aristotle will eventually dedicate his great work on ethics to him, though whether it was written for Nicomachus or edited by him after Aristotle's death remains uncertain. Aristotle also has responsibilities toward his daughter, Pythias, named for her mother who died years ago. She is growing into adulthood during these years at the Lyceum. Eventually, Aristotle arranges her marriage to Nicanor, the son of Proxenus, his old guardian, the man who raised him after his parents died. This marriage represents a connection back to his youth, a way of honoring old bonds and obligations, of weaving his daughter's future into the network of relationships that sustained him. So, Aristotle's household during the Lyceum years includes Herpyllis and their son Nicomachus, his daughter Pythias until her marriage, slaves who manage domestic work, and probably students who board with the family as part of their education. It is a busy household, full of life and activity, grounding Aristotle's abstract philosophical work in the concrete realities of daily living. But it is the intellectual work that defines these years, that makes them the culmination of Aristotle's life. Between 335 and 323 BCE, over 12 astonishingly productive years, Aristotle writes or compiles the works that will constitute his legacy to humanity. Let us take them area by area, not in strict chronological order, which is impossible to determine anyway, since many works were probably written over years, revised, expanded, but thematically, to understand the comprehensive vision Aristotle is building. First, logic, the tool of thinking itself. Aristotle develops what will later be called the organon, the instrument of thought. Here he articulates formal logic, the rules of valid inference, the structure that makes reasoning reliable. He identifies the syllogism as the basic form of deductive argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This seems obvious to us now, so obvious that it might think it hardly needed stating, but someone had to first articulate the form, had to identify the pattern that makes this reasoning valid and show why other patterns are invalid. That someone was Aristotle. He classifies different types of propositions, different types of inferences, different ways arguments can go wrong. He develops the theory of categories, the basic kinds of things we can say about anything: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and affection. He explores the nature of definition, of demonstration, of scientific knowledge.
This work on logic will dominate Western education for 2,000 years. Medieval students will learn Aristotelian logic as the foundation of all rational thought. Even today, when formal logic has become much more complex and mathematical, Aristotle's basic insights remain valid. He created the science of reasoning. Second, ethics, how to live well, how to achieve human flourishing. The Nicomachean Ethics, named for his son, is Aristotle's most sustained exploration of these questions. What is the good life? Not pleasure, though pleasure accompanies it. Not honor or wealth, though these may be part of it. The good life is eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, but really meaning flourishing, living well and doing well, achieving the fullness of human potential. And how do we achieve this? Through virtue, through excellence of character and intellect. Virtue is not knowledge, as Socrates thought. You can know what's right and still fail to do it. Virtue is a state of character,
developed through habituation, through choosing well again and again until excellence becomes second nature. Aristotle articulates his famous doctrine of the mean. Virtue lies between extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and extravagance. Proper pride is the mean between humility and arrogance. The virtuous person has learned through experience and practice to find the right balance, to feel and act appropriately in each situation. But knowing the mean is not mechanical. It requires phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to judge in particular circumstances what the right action is. This wisdom comes from experience, from having navigated many situations well, from understanding both general principles and particular contexts. And crucially, humans cannot flourish alone. We are political animals, naturally forming communities. Friendship is not a luxury, but essential to the good life. We need friends with whom to share virtuous activity, who call out the best in us, who make us better than we would be alone. The highest form of human activity, Aristotle argues, is contemplation, theoria, the activity of understanding for its own sake. When we engage in pure thought, seeking to understand reality simply because it is worth understanding, we are most fully human, most godlike. The life of philosophy, of inquiry and contemplation is the best life, though Aristotle recognizes that few can live it fully, that most people need to balance contemplation with the practical demands of life. Third, politics, the study of how humans organize themselves into communities and what makes those communities just and good. The politics is Aristotle's sustained exploration of the state, its nature and purpose, its different forms and their strengths and weaknesses. The state exists, Aristotle argues, not just to preserve life, but to promote the good life. We form political communities so we can flourish together, can achieve things impossible for isolated individuals or families. The purpose of the state is human flourishing, and the best government is one that promotes virtue and happiness for its citizens. Aristotle classifies governments by two criteria: how many rule and whether they rule for the common good or their own interest. Rule by one person can be monarchy, good, or tyranny, bad. Rule by the few can be aristocracy, good, or oligarchy, bad. Rule by the many can be polity, good, or democracy, bad, by which Aristotle means mob rule, not what we mean by democracy today. He analyzes what causes political stability and instability, what leads to revolution and how to prevent it. He discusses the relationship between rich and poor, the dangers of extreme inequality, the importance of a strong middle class. He explores questions of citizenship, education, property ownership, the role of women and slaves. His politics are not egalitarian by modern standards. He accepts slavery as natural for some people, considers women inferior to men in certain respects, believes some people are naturally suited to rule, while others to be ruled. These views are shaped by his society and represent real failures in his thinking. But he also insists that political power must serve the common good, that citizens must be educated in virtue, that the best regime balances different social elements, that law should rule rather than any individual's will. Fourth, natural philosophy and biology, the study of the physical world and living things. Here, Aristotle's years of empirical research culminate in systematic treatises that will remain the most comprehensive works on biology for nearly 2 millennia. The physics explores the nature of change, motion, causation. Why do things change? What makes an acorn become an oak tree, a child become an adult? Aristotle articulates his famous doctrine of the 4 causes.
To fully understand anything, you need to know its material cause, what it's made of, its formal cause, what makes it the kind of thing it is, its efficient cause, what brought it into being, and its final cause, what purpose it serves, what end it aims at. This emphasis on final causes, on purpose and teleology, is central to Aristotle's worldview. Everything in nature exists for a purpose. Birds have wings for flying, eyes exist for seeing, hearts exist for pumping blood. To understand something is to understand its purpose, its telos, the end towards which it naturally strives. In his biological works, History of Animals, Parts of Animals, Generation of Animals, Aristotle describes hundreds of species, their structures, behaviors, reproduction. He classifies them not arbitrarily, but by their essential characteristics, seeking natural kinds, trying to grasp the principles of organization that run through the living world.
Some of his observations are astonishingly accurate. He correctly describes the development of chicken embryos, the behavior of bees, the anatomy of dolphins, and their differences from fish. Other claims are wrong. He thinks the brain is a cooling organ and that thinking occurs in the heart. He believes in spontaneous generation of some creatures from mud or decaying matter. But the method is fundamentally sound. Observe carefully, compare systematically, seek patterns, explain by reference to causes and purposes. Fifth, metaphysics, the study of being as such, of what exists at the most fundamental level. The Metaphysics, compiled by his students from his lectures, explores the deepest questions of philosophy. What is substance? What makes something what it is and not something else? What is the relationship between form and matter, between actuality and potentiality? Aristotle argues against Plato's separated forms. The form of a thing is not separate from it in some transcendent realm. Rather, form and matter are principles within the thing itself. The form is what makes a lump of bronze into a statue, what makes organic matter into a living horse, what organizes matter into a particular kind of thing. Form and matter are inseparable. You cannot have a hoarseness floating around without matter, and matter without form would be pure potentiality, nothing actual. Everything in nature exists as a combination of actuality and potentiality. An acorn is actually an acorn, but potentially an oak tree. A child is actually a child, but potentially an adult. Change happens when potentiality becomes actuality, when what something can be becomes what it is. And at the top of this hierarchy, Aristotle posits the unmoved mover, the first cause that sets everything in motion but is itself unchanging. This is pure actuality with no potentiality, pure thought thinking itself, the divine principle that all other things strive toward as their ultimate end. It moves the universe not by pushing or pulling, but by being the object of love and desire. All things naturally move toward perfection, toward the full realization of their potential, and ultimate perfection is the unmoved mover. This concept will profoundly influence medieval theology, particularly Thomas Aquinas' proofs for God's existence. But for Aristotle, the unmoved mover is less a personal God and more a philosophical principle, the logical necessity at the foundation of a cosmos that is ordered, intelligible, moving according to purposes and ends. Sixth, poetry and rhetoric, the study of how language moves people, how narratives work, how persuasion happens. The Poetics, though it survives only partially, introduces concepts that still shape how we think about narrative and drama. Aristotle analyzes tragedy, identifying its essential elements: plot, character, thought, diction, spectacle, song. Plot is most important, the arrangement of incidents, the structure that gives tragedy its power. The best plots involve reversals and recognitions, moments when fortune changes and truth is revealed. The tragic hero is neither perfectly good nor completely evil, but someone like us, whose fall comes not from vice, but from some error or flaw, hamartia.
This fall arouses pity and fear in the audience and effects a catharsis, a purging or purification of these emotions. These concepts, tragic flaw, catharsis, the importance of plot structure, remain central to how we understand narrative across all media, from ancient tragedy to modern film. The rhetoric explores persuasion systematically, analyzing the different modes of appeal: logos, logical argument; pathos, emotional appeal; and ethos, the character and credibility of the speaker. Aristotle shows how effective persuasion requires understanding your audience, adapting your approach to their values and beliefs, combining rational argument with appropriate emotional appeals. All of this work, logic, ethics, politics, physics, biology, metaphysics, poetics, rhetoric, forms an interconnected system, a comprehensive vision of reality and how to understand it. Aristotle is attempting nothing less than to give an account of everything: how we should reason, how we should live, how we should organize ourselves politically, what the natural world is like, what exists at the deepest level, how language and art work. It is breathtakingly ambitious and remarkably successful given the limitations of his time and resources. Daily life at the Lyceum follows a rhythm shaped by these intellectual pursuits. Morning lectures for advanced students, working through difficult philosophical problems systematically. Afternoon lectures on more accessible topics: ethics, politics, rhetoric, open to anyone who wants to attend. Time for research, for supervising student projects, for writing and revising treatises. Meals taken communally, where conversation continues, where informal discussions lead to new insights. The students who gather at the Lyceum include some who will themselves become important philosophers and scholars. Theophrastus from Lesbos is Aristotle's closest colleague and intellectual heir. He will succeed Aristotle as head of the Lyceum and continue his work, particularly in botany and natural history. Eudemus of Rhodes works on mathematics and the history of science. Aristoxenus writes on music theory. Dicarius explores geography and cultural history. Strato of Lampsacus will eventually become the third head of the Lyceum, focusing on physics and natural philosophy.
These are not just students absorbing doctrine, but collaborators participating in an ongoing research program. They bring their own observations and ideas, challenge Aristotle's views, push the inquiry forward. The Lyceum is a genuine intellectual community, united by shared commitment to understanding, but diverse in individual interests and perspectives. The years pass. 335, 333, 330, 328, 325. Messages arrive from the east, from Alexander's campaigns. He has crossed into Asia, defeated the Persians at the Granicus River, liberated the Greek cities of Asia Minor. He has won again at Issus, capturing the Persian king's family. He has taken Egypt, founded Alexandria. He has fought the climactic battle at Gaugamela, destroyed the Persian army, declared himself king of Asia. He has burned Persepolis, the Persian capital. He has pushed beyond Persia into Bactria, into India, to the ends of the known world. Alexander sends back specimens, observations, funds for research. The relationship remains cordial, respectful, though they are now in very different worlds. Alexander is becoming something more than human, or perhaps less, losing his Greek identity in the vastness of his conquests, adopting Persian customs that horrify Greeks, demanding divine honors, executing friends on suspicion of treason. One of those executed is Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who accompanied the expedition as its historian. Callisthenes resists Alexander's adoption of proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostrating oneself before the king. For Greeks, this is worship, appropriate only for gods. Callisthenes protests publicly, alienates Alexander, and is eventually arrested on charges of conspiracy and executed. When news reaches Athens, Aristotle must feel grief for his nephew and unease about what Alexander is becoming. But these concerns are distant. Here at the Lyceum, the work continues. 12 years, from 335 to 323 BCE,
12 years of extraordinary productivity, of systematic research and writing, of teaching and collaboration. 12 years during which Aristotle creates the works that will define his legacy, that will shape how humans think about logic, ethics, politics, nature, existence itself. They are the culmination of everything, of his medical training in Stagira, his 20 years at the academy absorbing and questioning Plato, his research in Assos and Lesbos, his experience teaching Alexander, his accumulated wisdom approaching old age. Everything comes together here, in these years at the Lyceum, in this burst of creative, intellectual work that few philosophers ever match. Aristotle is now in his 60s, still vigorous, but aware that time is limited. He has built something that will last, an institution, a library, a body of work. He has students who will carry on the research. He has written treatises that systematize knowledge across every field of inquiry. But time, as it does for everyone, is running out. And events beyond his control, events unfolding thousands of miles away in Babylon, are about to shatter the peace of the Lyceum and force Aristotle into one final displacement.
The news arrives in waves, traveling west from Babylon along the great roads that connect Alexander's vast empire, carried by messengers on horseback, by ship across the Mediterranean, spreading from city to city until it reaches Athens in the early summer of 323 BCE. Alexander is ill. Alexander is dying. Alexander is dead. It happens in June in the palace at Babylon, where Alexander has established his court, surrounded by the luxury and splendor of conquered Persia. He is 32 years old, master of an empire that stretches from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia, the largest empire the world has ever seen, conquered in barely a decade of relentless campaigning. He has defeated every enemy, captured every city, pushed his army to the ends of the known world and beyond. And now, after a banquet, he falls ill. Fever grips him. He grows weaker day by day. His generals gather around his bed, desperate, helpless. After 10 days of suffering, Alexander dies without clearly naming a successor, leaving only the cryptic statement, if the sources are to be believed, that his empire should go to the strongest. The causes of his death remain mysterious even today. Fever, perhaps malaria or typhoid. Poisoning, though no evidence proves this despite endless speculation. Simply exhaustion, the accumulated toll of wounds and hardships and the superhuman exertion of conquering the world. Whatever the medical reality, the political result is immediate and catastrophic. Alexander's empire, held together only by his will and charisma, begins to fragment before his body is even cold. His generals, the companions who fought beside him, who followed him across Asia, immediately begin maneuvering for position. Ptolemy will seize Egypt, Seleucus will take the eastern territories, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander will fight over Macedonia and Greece. The wars of the successors, brutal conflicts that will last for decades, have begun. But the immediate impact on Greece is liberation, or so it seems at first. The Macedonian garrisons that have kept Greek cities in submission are suddenly vulnerable, their authority questionable, their commander dead. The news ignites something that has been smoldering for years in Athens and other Greek cities, the desperate desire for freedom, the hatred of Macedonian domination, the memory of autonomy and self-governance. Athens rises in revolt. The orator Hyperides, who has long opposed Macedonian power, addresses the assembly with passionate speeches calling for resistance. Other Greek cities join the rebellion, Aetolians, Thessalians, others who see this moment as their chance to throw off the foreign yoke. They raise armies, elect commanders. This is the Lamian War, named for the city of Lamia where much of the fighting will occur, a last attempt by the Greek city-states to reclaim their independence. For a few months, success seems possible.
the allied Greek forces defeat Macedonian troops at Thermopylae, the historic pass where the Spartans once made their stand against Persia. They trap Antipater, the Macedonian regent, in Lamia itself. The Macedonian military machine, which seemed invincible under Philip and Alexander, appears vulnerable after all. But Athens' rebellion means immediate danger for anyone associated with Macedonia, and Aristotle, despite his 12 years at the Lyceum, despite his profound contributions to Athenian intellectual life, is still seen as a Macedonian, still remembered as Alexander's tutor, still tainted by those connections that once brought him honor and patronage. The political climate turns ugly. Anti-Macedonian sentiment, long suppressed, erupts into the open. Anyone connected to the hated conqueror becomes a target, and someone decides that Aristotle is a convenient target, a way to strike symbolically at Macedonian influence while settling philosophical scores. A charge is brought against him. The legal pretext is asabia, impiety, the same charge that was used against Socrates more than 70 years earlier. The specific accusation involves a hymn Aristotle wrote decades ago in honor of Hermias, his old friend and patron who was captured and executed by the Persians back in the 340s. The hymn, critics now claim, treats Hermias as if he were a god, offering him honors appropriate only for immortals. This is blasphemy, violation of proper religious practice, an offense against the gods and against Athenian tradition.
It is a flimsy charge, transparently political. The hymn was written 40 years ago and caused no controversy at the time. But in the superheated atmosphere of 323 BCE, with Athens at war with Macedonia, with mobs ready to turn against anyone associated with the enemy, legal niceties matter less than political expediency. Aristotle understands immediately what is happening. This is not really about a hymn or about proper religious honors. This is about punishing someone connected to Alexander, about Athenian resentment finding an outlet, about the danger of being a foreign philosopher in a city convulsed by nationalistic fervor. He has seen this before. Socrates was charged with impiety, with corrupting the youth and introducing new gods, and chose to stay, to defend himself before an Athenian jury, to accept their verdict even though it meant death. Socrates believed in Athenian law, in the social contract, in facing injustice with philosophical courage rather than running away. But Aristotle is not Socrates. He is 62 years old. He has a family to protect, Herpellus, his son Nicomachus, his daughter Pythias and her family. He has the Lyceum to preserve, students and colleagues whose work should continue. He has no illusions about Athenian justice when political passions run high, when foreign philosophers become convenient scapegoats. And perhaps most fundamentally, Aristotle has a different philosophical temperament than Socrates. Socrates saw philosophy as a mission that required staying and facing death. Aristotle sees philosophy as a systematic pursuit of knowledge that requires staying alive to continue the work. "I will not let Athens sin twice against philosophy," he reportedly says, though the line may be too perfect, too neat, invented by later writers who loved a good dramatic statement. But whether he said exactly these words or not, the sentiment is clear. Socrates' execution was a stain on Athens, a crime against wisdom itself. Aristotle will not give the Athenians a chance to repeat it. His decision is swift. Within days, perhaps within hours of the formal charge being brought, Aristotle begins making arrangements to leave. There is no time for elaborate preparations, no time for drawn-out farewells. He must leave before the legal process advances, before he can be formally arrested and prevented from departing. He puts his affairs in order as quickly as possible. Theophrastus, his most trusted colleague, will take over leadership of the Lyceum. The school will continue, the research will go on, the library will be preserved. His will, which he updates or finalizes now, provides for everyone in his household, Herpellus, Nicomachus, Pythias, the slaves who have served him faithfully.
He gathers what he absolutely must take, some books perhaps, though most of his library must stay, personal items, money for the journey and for living elsewhere. And then he leaves Athens, slipping away before the authorities can stop him, abandoning the city where he spent the most productive years of his life. Where can he go? Macedonia is embroiled in the succession crisis, unsafe and chaotic. Going there would only confirm the accusations against him. Assos and Lesbos, where he lived before, are too close to ongoing conflicts. He needs somewhere Greek, somewhere outside Athenian jurisdiction, somewhere he has a legitimate claim to protection. He thinks of his mother. Phaestis, who died when he was a child, came from Chalcis on the island of Euboea, just across a narrow strait from the Greek mainland. Through her, Aristotle has family connections there, property rights perhaps, a claim to residence. Chalcis is close enough to Athens to receive news, to maintain contact with the Lyceum, but far enough away to be outside Athenian legal authority. So Aristotle sails to Chalcis, crossing the water that separates him from the life he has built, carrying with him the knowledge that he will never return to Athens, never walk again through the gardens of the Lyceum, never teach again in the Peripatos. He is 62 years old, and he is in exile. Chalcis receives him. The city is not large, not a center of learning like Athens, but it is respectable, prosperous, Greek. Aristotle settles into a house, perhaps one that belonged to his mother's family, perhaps one he purchases or rents for money from his estate. He tries to continue his work, but his heart cannot be in it. How can he do philosophy in isolation, cut off from his students, from his library, from the intellectual community he spent decades building? And his health is failing. He has stomach problems, chronic pain, difficulty eating, progressive deterioration. Perhaps it is an ulcer, exacerbated by stress. Perhaps cancer. Perhaps some other disease that ancient medicine cannot diagnose or treat. The ancient sources speak vaguely of a disease of the digestive system, of wasting, of pain.
The months pass. Summer fades into autumn. News arrives from the mainland. The war continues, though not well for Athens and its allies. Macedonian reinforcements have arrived from Asia. Antipater has escaped from Lamia. The tide is turning. Athens will lose this war, will be forced to accept even harsher terms of submission, will see its democracy curtailed and its autonomy reduced to almost nothing. But Aristotle will not witness the outcome. In October of 322 BCE, less than a year after fleeing Athens, after only a few months in Chalcis, Aristotle dies. He is 62 years old, the same age as Plato was when Aristotle first met him, young enough that he might have had years of productive work still ahead if circumstances had been different. The cause is almost certainly his stomach ailment, though later sources will invent more dramatic deaths. One story claims he threw himself into the Euripus Strait beside Chalcis, frustrated that he couldn't explain its unusual tides that flow back and forth multiple times daily. It is a good story, the philosopher defeated by nature's mysteries, but it is only a story. The reality is simpler and sadder. An old man, in exile, in pain, dying far from his life's work. But before he dies, Aristotle does one final thing that reveals his character. He updates his will, or perhaps simply ensures it is properly witnessed and recorded. The will survives, preserved in the biography of Diogenes Laertius, and it is a remarkably humane document. He names Nicanor, his daughter's husband, as executor, the son of Proxenus who raised him, completing the circle of obligation and gratitude that connects his life. He provides for his daughter Pythias and his son Nicomachus, ensuring they will have the resources they need. He asks that Nicomachus, when he comes of age, should take care of the Lyceum and carry on his father's work if he is able. He provides generously for her Pillis, the woman who has been his companion for so many years. She can continue living in his house in Stagira, the rebuilt city that Philip restored, or, if she prefers, in his father's house there. She is to receive money, servants, whatever she needs to live comfortably.
The will speaks with obvious affection and respect, making clear that her Pillis was more than just a concubine, that she was a genuine partner who deserves care and honor. And remarkably, tenderly, he asks that when he is buried, his bones should be placed beside those of Pythias, his first wife, who died young in Lesbos decades ago, whom he never forgot, despite remarrying, despite building a new life. Even in death, he wants to lie beside her. The will also addresses his slaves, those human beings he owns, as every prosperous Greek does, whose labor makes his scholarly life possible. He frees several of them, specifying that they should not be sold, but liberated after serving Nicanor for a time. He mentions a woman named Umbrachus, who cared for him, who should be given her freedom along with whatever she has earned. Other slaves are provided for, their futures considered. By the standards of his time, this is enlightened, compassionate. Aristotle accepts slavery as an institution. He argues in his Politics that some people are naturally suited to be slaves, but he also treats the actual slaves in his household as human beings deserving of consideration and eventual freedom. The will is witnessed, sealed, recorded. The funeral rites are performed according to Greek custom, the body washed, dressed, mourned, cremated, or buried. His students and colleagues in Athens receive the news. Theophratus assumes leadership of the Lyceum, which will continue for centuries as a center of philosophical education. His family grieves, the philosophical community grieves. But in the larger world, Aristotle's death barely registers. Athens is losing a war. Alexander's generals are fighting over his empire. The Greek world is convulsing with change. One philosopher dying in exile on Obeah is a minor footnote to the great events shaking civilization. No one knows yet that this dead philosopher's works will outlast all empires, that his ideas will shape human thought for 2,000 years, that centuries after Alexander's conquests are forgotten except for historians, Aristotle's treatises will still be studied, still be debated, still be teaching humanity how to think.